Welcome back to the Foreign Report. I'm Sina Ghaznavi. You just heard Travis and I have a absolute breakdown at how J.D. Vance does his doublespeak and how this whole administration is pretty diluted and stuff. And, of course, by the time this episode comes out, I'm sure we'll know a lot more information. And hopefully another war won't break out in the 2 days between the recording time and when we drop the episode. It's actually less than 2 days because we drop very early on Friday mornings, but it is it's crazy how fast things are moving. This interview, though, is with Jonathan Panikoff. He's the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative and a former deputy national intelligence officer. Like I said, he's at the Atlantic Council. Very great outfit. Let's go to the interview. I think you'll have a good time. He was a really fun guy to talk with, and I think he's going to come back on the show. How are you, Jonathan? Thank you so much for joining us.
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So I tell you what, I wish we were having you on during a much more boring time in geopolitics when we could just talk about really kind of interesting things that are happening around the world, and we could just wax on some sort of intellectual level as opposed to I'm an Iranian American. I'm utterly exhausted from the last 10 days. I've been eating ice cream every single day to try to stress eat my way through this whole thing. And I am very confused at a lot of things. So hopefully you can help bring some clarity to me and our audience.
I'll certainly do my best. Look, I've got two young kids, and they're trying to wonder why their secret candy stash has been going down so much at such a rapid rate. So, look, I'm here to help as much as I can.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, okay, I'm doing this a lot now. It's Tuesday at 11:40 a.m. Pacific time. Who knows? Every time I do record something, the time it comes out, the entire geopolitical landscape changes. So let's see what's going on there. As of this morning, there is what we would call a ceasefire, which I don't know. It's like that old Princess Bride line. I don't think that word means what you think it means. The word ceasefire has come up. Trump is asserting that the ceasefire is holding, but at the time of this recording, it is apparently holding. But they did exchange some missile fire. I don't know who started it. Apparently, Israel started it, and then Iran responded. You can tell me what happened. But really, I want to get to, what do you think is the likeliest outcome of all this?
You know, it's funny on the missile fire because it happened overnight or pretty late from when it was supposed to start. And I had some Israelis immediately tell me they fired after the deadline, after the ceasefire deadline. The Iranians did. And then I had some other contacts say, no, they didn't fire after the deadline. It just landed after the deadline. And so the Israelis wanted to get back. I don't know what the truth is. And honestly, I'm not sure at this point it mattered. To President Trump's credit on this particular point, he was pretty angry this morning. In fact, I think his own incentives wanted the ceasefire desperately to hold. And so he was pretty harsh with the Israelis and did get them to pull back from what I think were the initial targets. And so it was a very minor target that was struck in the end by the Israelis. I don't think the Iranians are going to respond to it. And so now I think the ceasefire is holding. The way you know that, and to be fair, is that you have the Israelis having said to people that public gatherings are now allowed, that people can go out of their homes. They're not expecting more sirens. Ben Gurion Airport, the main airport in Israel, is planning to reopen and get back to normal as soon as possible. So, I think there's reason to be optimism. Both sides have real negative incentives for this to restart anytime soon. So I think ceasefire, it's a tough term. You're right. It does not mean forever. I don't think this is going to last, 5, 10, 20 years. But do I think it'll last in the coming days, weeks, months, and hopefully a couple years at least? Yeah, I think it's possible.
That's really interesting. Okay, I want to come back to that, but I want to get to maybe the clear and present kind of situation we're going to be in with a U.S. Iranian nuclear deal that's obviously going to have Israel as part of this. You wrote an article where you kind of grade the possible outcomes in this, and you're a tough grader. So why don't you tell me a little bit about some of the kind of options? What's the hard lines of the negotiations are kind of difficult to maintain. But in your mind, what should be the hard line for the U.S. in any deal? What should
Yeah.
be what's Iran's hard line as well from the hardliners,
It's,
if you will?
as you said, the last 2 weeks, it's just like all time has completely stopped in some ways. It's been so nutty that when I wrote that article, it was actually when negotiations going on before the strikes. And so I don't
Mm.
know if my grading, would be the same. I don't want to be the kid in class begging the professor for a better grade based on some of my answers, but I'm going to have to go back and actually reconsider this a little bit. Look, I think not using the numerical grades, which my British friends complained to me, they didn't understand what I was talking about anyways. The challenge is now we are in a new paradigm. And whether we want it to be in this new paradigm or not is somewhat irrelevant, right? I think there's a lot of historical arguments that can and will be really interesting to be had about whether Israel really had to strike when it struck, about the fight between Israeli intelligence assessments and U.S. intelligence assessments. My immediate reaction is none of that actually matters in terms of what policy should be now. The paradigm has changed. And so I think there's two problems that need to be thought about from the US side. One is, look, you undertook this operation to destroy Iran's nuclear program. I'm skeptical that that's happened in full. There's been a lot of
Yeah.
reporting that Iran may have gotten quite a bit of highly enriched uranium out of Fordo beforehand. Maybe not. I hope not. But if they did, that enriched uranium is at 60%. It takes a couple hundred machines, which isn't really that much, to get it to 90% or weapons grade. And then the question, now you're back again to weaponization. And so I think it's what necessitates, in my mind, the need for diplomacy to still exist and to have an actual diplomatic solution long term. Because otherwise, what will happen is if you still have the Iranians with some amount of enriched uranium, then despite all the scientists who were killed by the Israelis, they're going to try and figure out how to potentially rebuild it. And so your options are either you've had a diplomatic framework in place to prevent this, and the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, on the ground, or you're going to strike again. And you're going to strike whatever new secretive site is happening. And so I think from my perspective, the place to start now probably is, look, Iran can't be enriching uranium, right? I think if you really want a better grade, that's where you have to start. But that doesn't mean that Iran can't have what it's always claimed publicly is what it really wants, which is a civilian nuclear program. I am highly skeptical that that was its only goal. Iran really did want it to at least have the opportunity for a nuclear weapon. But there is an outcome here where you go back to what I thought was actually a somewhat creative idea of some sort of consortium, for example, of foreign countries that are producing or enriching the uranium, running it through the fuel cycle in Iran, and then it gets exported back out. I don't think that's, an unreasonable starting place for the Americans. I think if the Iranians stick with no, we still demand enrichment in Iran, then especially now that's going to be a non-starter for the U.S. And it should be. If the Americans went back to, what Steve Witkoff originally, before President Trump seemed to push him away, that the Iranians can have enrichment up to 3.67%, which is the amount for civilian nuclear power.
Right. They haven't met. There's no we're going to meet. They've kind of danced around it a little bit that they're open to it, but how do you even get people in the same room at this point? I mean, people, it's I don't want to be reductive and say feelings have been hurt, but really some people, this is wild. It just seems like no one was playing. Everyone had an ace up there. Everyone was trying to underhand the other party in this situation as well.
I think that's right. It is wild. I mean, even kind of the end of this, that I saw the U.S. and Qataris were talking to the Iranians about a ceasefire. It took me pause. I paused for a second because I said, so the country that just completely struck and bombed you with a bomb that's never been used before because it's so massive is the intermediary for the ceasefire? That's quite unusual, I think, in international diplomacy.
What do you think? Where does that come from? Do you think they just think, okay, we know if we don't make a deal or we don't come to the table, it's a wrap for us. And their primary concern is staying in power as a theocracy.
Yeah, I mean, look, on the immediate diplomacy side, I think despite that, you're going to need some sort of intermediary, whether it's the Omanis or the Swiss or the Norwegians. There's rumors of the Chinese. I don't think you'll be able to have the type of diplomacy the U.S. had to get the ceasefire lasting for a U.S. Iran negotiation over what might remain of its nuclear program. But for the Iranians, look, I think they were really looking for an off ramp. Iran traditionally, its power projection is predicated on what amounts to a triad or a three-legged stool, right? So its power projection in the region was based on its ballistic missile program, its nuclear program, and its proxy, or in some cases, its really partner network. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Iraqi Shia militant groups. All of that has been significantly diminished over the last year plus, especially on the proxy side, and obviously now the ballistic missile threat in the nuclear program in the last 2 weeks by the Israelis mostly, and now by the U.S. at the end. I think ultimately the Iranians looked at this and took a pretty pragmatic course and said, if we retaliate to the U.S. strikes in a way that escalates the situation, then maybe Trump really isn't looking for regime change right now, but this is where we could end up. And I think Iranian regime survival
Yeah.
is always the number one factor in the leadership's consideration. It's, does the regime fundamentally survive? We've seen threats before to it, internal versus external. We can talk about. I think they're really very, very different about what regime change means. But I think that was a significant concern to them. They had been so diminished, they were short of weapons, that I think they really looked for and wanted a diplomatic off ramp. And I think you saw that in how they retaliated to the United States.
It seemed like when they started this, let's say JCPOA 2.0, that it was going to be a similar deal as Obama's deal, and then maybe some more open lines of capitalism where you could go get a Starbucks cold brew in Tehran now or something like that.
Yeah.
But that seemed to be a mirror image of what maybe Hamas was seeing happen through the Abraham Accords between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and they were like, oh, we're gonna flip the table. Does that track for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting parallel. I think it tracks to some extent. I think the Iranians certainly are concerned in terms of the regional realignments and balance of power, but in some ways, their own efforts in the three categories I mentioned have brought about the very thing that they were so scared about. Because I think this has
Yeah.
actually opened up an opportunity for significant. Certainly, we're going to see a shift in the balance of power in the region, but a significant opportunity if the Israelis are in the U.S. can be strategic enough to capitalize on that, and that's always quite a big if.
Oh, that
I
sounds
think
like you want people to be calm and pragmatic and
rational, yeah,
rational. Man,
yeah.
I don't know. It seems difficult
Well,
right
I mean,
now.
look, to be fair, I mean, I might have been out of a career long ago as a Middle East specialized intel officer if the region were calm and rational. It's just, this is what's kept me in business. But it's not what even I want as just a human being, right? I think the region has so much potential, but it keeps being undermined by its own bad actors and its own short term actions. The reality is, look, there is a direct line that I think can and should be made between October 7th and where we are literally today, June 24th. Um, and you can go back further than that, right? Hamas may not have been ordered by Iran to take actions that it took on October 7th, but the training, most of the weapons,
Yes.
the financing for them all came from Iran. 6 months into the war, though, like in March of 24, if you looked around the region, you would have said the Iranians are really riding high. Like they're having a lot of success. Hamas has attacked sufficiently. There's a lot of global attention that's become very, very negative towards Israel, which still exists, and I think is still going to be a factor. But Hamas, from just a power projection, was in good shape, and it's all gone. That was not Iran's plan. right?
Yeah.
That was not the goal here. And so I think the question becomes, look, if people can be smart enough and strategic enough, I think the worst thing Israel can do is keep the war in Gaza going. I don't understand what the strategic objectives are anymore. I understood it for actually quite a while. I know there's going to be, I'm sure, a lot of listeners who are upset to hear that, or some who are thrilled to hear that. Unfortunately, this isn't an issue with a lot of nuance in any of the discussions, and I can understand that given the amount of death and destruction that we have seen. But from a purely step back analytic position, I could understand some of it. The best thing Israel could do is end the war, because now there's a real opportunity to make a decision about, do you want to go toward a region that is more integrated, in which you are a central focused player, or do you want to keep giving in to, frankly, right-wing ultranationalists in Israel, or if you're the Iranians and others, um, terrorists like Hamas and groups like that, because somebody else will come after Hamas or be an offshoot of Hamas, or Hamas will continue. And do you want to have the type of situation where we just keep repeating this pattern, or do we finally want to break it? And more than one actor gets a choice in this, and it's hard for anybody in kind of the center to, I think, have the ability to really move the needle. But I think there's an opportunity now, more different than ever, to move it, because you don't have the Gulf allies even now under threat of Iran's nuclear program and potential proliferation. You have their ballistic missile program significantly diminished. There's still really a lot of weapons Iran can use, but they may not be as threatening. And so there's huge opportunities if folks are smart enough to be able to take them.
I think that's a really important point because it kind of speaks to this whole idea of like the regime change. I mean, Israel bombed the oil and industrial plants, and even heck, even when the U.S. bombed the nuclear facilities, I don't see how that was a reasonable or pragmatic way of trying to spur regime change, because the dollars that were spent to build those things came from the people of Iran. And so despite how much they hate their own government passionately, it's still more of their own money being bankrupted by a regime and by foreign powers that have meddled in their country. So how does the regime change aspect of this come into play? Because it's going to be a big part of the negotiations. The biggest critique Trump had of the first JCPOA was that it didn't do anything about the proxies. It didn't do anything about the regime. People like me in the diaspora were like, this is a huge gamble. You're not going to really probably get the regime out of there with this deal. It's just kind of locking them in. And so you could get my mother on the phone. She'll talk your ear off about how badly this was a deal the first time, but it was at least keeping the nuclear stuff in check. How does the regime change conversation fold in here?
Yeah, I seem to disappoint almost everybody on my regime change answer. The last couple, like those who really want regime change and those who really don't. Look, I think there's a really big difference between regime change. This isn't just about Iran, just in general. That regime change that comes from an external prompt versus an internal prompt.
Yeah.
Historically, external prompts tend to lead to regime change that doesn't actually last. That's not particularly stable, right? And maybe it lasts a decade, maybe it lasts two, maybe it lasts three. But if you're talking about generations upon generations, centuries of solid regimes, it tends not to last if it's coming from an external prompt. And it's worse, and the U.S. now has some experience in this. If you've had regime change that fundamentally you don't know what comes next, and you don't even have a plan for what comes next and how to do this. And that, to me, seems to be where we were with Iran. Regime change, to me, from this conflict as an end strategic goal of Israel's or the U.S. doesn't make sense. And a lot of people have said to me, people I really respect, whatever comes next has to be better than this regime. And I've said to them, no, it doesn't. Right?
Yeah.
History tells us that no, it doesn't. Fundamentally, especially from an external prompt, there's a lot of experience that I think what comes next in Iran, unfortunately, when it comes to regime change, isn't democracy. I think what
Yeah.
comes next is IRGC-istan. In other words,
Yeah.
is some sort of military autocracy with a fig leaf, perhaps, to the current theocratic regime, not the liberal Western-oriented democracy. If that's what you want, and that is, I would love to see that. I think most people would love to see that. I think that has to come from inside. And the problem with it coming from inside is that takes generations upon generations sometimes, right? I think the Green Revolution in 2009 is a really good example. The 2022 Women Life Freedom Movement is a really good example. And I upset some people at the time. I was just coming out of the intelligence community and I hadn't quite figured out how to engage. And I think I was on a Twitter Spaces and I said something, I wasn't trying to be flippant, and I said something like, oh no, this isn't going to result in regime change. It's not going to work.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, and I had people yelling at me, and I really regret saying it. Like, I didn't mean it like that. It was just, as an analyst, there's a fundamental reason for those types of revolutions to work. Generally, you need somebody with guns to switch sides. And I know that sounds crude, but historically, right, you need somebody, you're going to need that at some point, especially from an autocratic regime, not a regime that's traditionally been democratic, where that just got corrupted. And so I don't see any evidence, and I didn't at the time, that the IRGC, the Basij, the Standing Army, the civil police were planning to switch sides. And so I think you can get there. I think eventually you may get there, but it wasn't going to come, I don't think, in a way that's actually long-term productive, or even short-term potentially, through external bombing of either Israel or the U.S. And so I think that not being the strategic priority here was a smart move by the U.S. and even by Israel. It wasn't one of their initial ones, though maybe we were getting some mission creep there at the end.
But I think they named it Operation Rising Lion. I mean, I've got the Persian lion tattoo on my body. I know what he was trying to say with that.
Yeah.
I mean, every Iranian knew what he was trying to do. Reza Pahlavi was sitting in the green room, ready to go, and a lot of us in the diaspora, not a big fan. But to your point, though, which I really am so happy you made, is so many people in the diaspora and so many people are just like, anything has to be better than the current regime. And I agree with you. No, it doesn't. I have talked to so many people and friends that are Iranian and relatives, and they're just like, anything but this regime. And I'm like, listen, I'm no foreign policy expert, but I've read enough to know that it doesn't have to be better. It could be worse very quickly. And the reason those 2009 and 2022 rise ups and potential revolutions didn't occur is because the Iranian government had Hezbollah and Syria to come in with mercenaries and just kill their own populace. They're literally killing people. So it's tough to protest when you're being shot at with not rubber bullets, actual bullets. And so that keeps a lot of people at home. Okay, so that's the regime change issue. Talk to me about the nuclear. We talked about, we just reset the clock for the Islamic Republic when it comes to their nuclear plans. You mentioned earlier that you can't really get rid of the know-how. And so maybe this ceasefire will last months, days, up to a year. Why wouldn't the Islamic Republic want a bomb? Like, what else could you be enriching uranium for? I read that maybe like a nuclear sub, but like, what else are we, like, if I'm a theocracy, I'm looking around and I'm thinking, man, everyone that's got a nuke is kind of doing whatever they want. Maybe we should probably get one. Am I wrong?
Yeah. No, I look, I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that hasn't come out a lot yet, and I'm not an expert on North Korea, I don't want to pretend to be, but I know enough and I've talked to enough that, I think the Iranians looked at the North Koreans and in some ways and kept saying, look, they never got stopped. Everybody kept saying, you got to stop the madman of Kim Jong-un. You've got to stop them. They never got stopped. Why would we not at least have this as a potential option that we can go to? I think there's a big debate still about not only how close they were, but what their actual intent was. Look, I'm on, I think, still the minority, especially kind of within the U.S. policy community, in my opinion on this. I wrote a piece, I think in November of 2022, that basically said Iran has already decided to get a bomb. That maybe they haven't decided when they're going to get it or how they're going to get it, but their actions are clear that they want that capability. They want to be able to get a bomb. And so you're doing everything possible to get it. And, right. And this is, I will say, the Israeli argument from how their intel analysts were looking at it, that Iran was making progress in ways that, yes, could be dual use or could be for other things, but also could be to actually weaponize and get a bomb. And they had been successful on a lot of those tests and a lot of that progress. And so they couldn't wait. And could the Israelis have waited? Could they not have? I think that's an open question. I think the timing of it is particularly interesting. But I think the Iranian regime absolutely sees, look, at the end of the day, Pakistan and India, everyone was terrified of the war that just happened because they're both nuclear powers.
Yes.
Russia, what keeps people up at night about Ukraine is whether Putin is going to use a nuclear bomb. That leads to huge amounts of deterrence capability and a huge amount of power projection in a region where nobody else has a nuclear weapon aside from one state, and that one state happens to be your arch nemesis. And so
Yeah.
I think it's not a surprise to think through just logically from even forgetting the scientific side of this, just the leadership and political intention side of this, that yes, there was a goal to eventually be able to have a bomb. I think the conversation about whether Iran really wanted one or not is a little bit silly and a little bit of a red herring, as we call it. It's an unnecessary distraction. I think the question of what the timing would have been and would we have had more time, or do we have more time, or how much time do we have now, is a much more legitimate way to think through this issue.
I see. So is that maybe explain why? So I know roughly, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's like three big ways that you can tell what Iran's doing with their nuclear weapons or nuclear capabilities. There's literal on the ground spies, intelligence, infiltrating different things, and at the computer, like Mission Impossible's flying down from the ceiling, whatever. I don't know. I'm not going to act like I know how these things work. But then there's like the satellite imagery, right? Where you see like a big truck, or you can like kind of determine through satellite imagery what's happening. And then there's the IAEA and stuff. So we got plenty of stuff quarterly from the IAEA. There's satellite imagery that I'm sure people are going. But all three of those things seem like you could build a pretty good picture. Why? Is that why? Is that it's just too hard to just tell what's in a theocracy's mind to know their intent?
Yeah. So first, let me start with the Mission Impossible thing, because as a general rule, and I've been public about this with people, I don't tend to talk about the IC a lot and how it does its work.
Sure.
But I promise everybody and every listener, it's got nothing. It's nothing like Mission Impossible. It's weird to me that every CIA related movie or MI6 related movie, nobody ever writes a report.
Well,
And
that'd
even
be a
my
boring
friends-
way to do a movie, Jonathan.
It would
No
be
one wants to see
incredibly
me at the
boring.
computer. You got to have a hacker at the computer.
So I get it. It's why I can watch these movies and not feel like I'm just back at work, right?
Or is that exactly something that someone doing that type of stuff would say to make us think that it's not like that? Take that for it.
Yeah, I'll let
Well
you
played,
leave
Jonathan.
listeners.
Well played. I'll let you go on. Yeah.
There's somewhere a very conspiratorial listener who's going to think this is quite literal, and I'm
Yeah.
going to get a really bad email out of this. Look, on the first one, I think your point on all three of those is fair. The bottom line question, why I actually think it's really important that there be some sort of diplomacy, that Iran stays in the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the IAEA has access to the ground, right? It's actually really hard to tell, right? A lot of Iran's facilities were so far underground. It's why the U.S. had to bomb Fordo and Israel couldn't, and use what are called the bunker busters, the massive ordnance penetrators, because actually satellite imagery, right, can't get to that, right? The intelligence is a little bit of a gap. I think the problem that a lot of times we have is a bit of a misnomer, right? Intelligence analysis as a whole is a art, not a science, and the intel community doesn't make predictions. It makes judgments. And so that means that everybody can be looking at the same information, and you can have people in really good faith come to different conclusions based on the exact same information. And part of that goes to exactly what you're saying, right? It's a leadership intention. It gets very hard to imagine that there's a silver bullet. And so you're reading into all of these intentions through different indicators. And there are real ways to think through this that are not just kind of whims, but there are exercises that can be done to really try and figure these things out. But they're hard. They're really hard questions. And so I think going forward, we'll try some of these same things and we'll do our best, but it's going to be hard to tell, I think for sure. It's going to take some time. It's why there isn't immediately an assessment of did the US actually destroy all of Iran's nuclear program or
Yeah.
did it not? It's going to take, I think, weeks to months, most likely, to really understand that. And that's from, the intelligence side. In the public, it may take even longer for that to come out.
Man, I'm sure everyone will be very calm and just be drinking tea while we figure out what everything that's happening. Okay, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to also think about what is Putin and China. What is Xi and Putin doing in the course of all of this? Putin, I know, and Russia had a security agreement that they signed with Iran in January. I'll tell you what, I wouldn't want to sign a security agreement with Russia if this is how they're going to secure me in any way. Is it true that the Iranians went to them and they said, "Hey, we'd like a little bit of help," and Putin was like, "My calendar is full. I don't know what happened."
Well, look, the Russia side of this is really interesting. I don't know any more than right? I work for a think tank now, so I'm reading the same thing you are and hearing the same thing you are. That's what may have come out. I think there's also a point when the Israelis took out the S-300, which was supposed to be right the air defense system that the Russians sold to the
Right.
Iranians in October when this happened. My first thought was, boy, Tehran really should ask for its money back. Like,
Yeah.
really, that didn't work very well. And I've had a number of actual defense experts and technical experts like walk me through it. And I know they're right on the nuances, but my conclusion is still the same. Like, I'd still ask for my money back. I think what this reflected is a bit of an asymmetry in the relationship. I think Tehran has, over the last few years, looked at Russia and said, look, we've provided drones that have been significantly helpful in Ukraine. We've been a meaningful partner on some other defense initiatives that you've wanted. We were a good partner in Syria before everything, collapsed from their perspective. I think Iran and Tehran has long felt like Russia owed them to some extent.
Mm.
The Russia experts I speak to say, yeah, Moscow never felt that way. It's almost like an unrequited love in some ways. And I think the question going forward, though, is that what it's going to be like? Or is Iran and Russia going to be so isolated now in the coming years? And Russia really concerned, and I think they are, over how much they're influenced throughout the entirety of the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya, where they're struggling, in Iran, has been so diminished that they say, okay, we're kind of forced into this relationship that actually is more strategic, even if we didn't want it to be. And then what does that strategic relationship look like? And is it that Russia comes back and gives Iran not just the S-300, but the S-400, a much more advanced air defense system, to be non-technical about it? Is it that eventually you go from there to Russia helping Iran rebuild its ballistic missile capability? And then it gets to be a really hard question, because now if you've got Russians running around Iran helping with all these things, I think for the Israelis and for the US, it probably gets harder to say, yeah, we're going to bomb that again, or we're going to go through this
Yeah.
again. And so it's actually a really important reason that you get back to some sort of diplomacy to try to shut off these avenues. But we're going to see, especially in Moscow's case. In China's case, it's a little different. I think China's case, a lot of folks throughout the region have been really, really disappointed because they have high expectations of China, and then China never really shows up in their minds unless it's in their own interest. China's real concern is their own economy, and that's an energy question and frankly, a oil question, as it's driven by oil, natural gas. I think the relationship probably may not change that much. I think their interest is really seeing just a stable Iran. I don't know that they care particularly if it's weak or powerful. I think they prefer it to be powerful simply because it's another way to dig at the U.S. and the U.S.'s closest allies like Israel. But I don't think at the end of the day they're going to put any effort into trying to make Iran more powerful. I think they'll help with the ballistic missile program if they wanted to. I think they help around the margins. But ultimately, I think the real question strategically is probably going to be more on the Russia side than China.
Jonathan Panikoff from the Atlantic Council. It's Tuesday. What do you think is going to happen on Friday? Between now and Friday?
I did mention we don't tend to make predictions.
I'm sorry,
Look,
but it's like I know it's hard.
I know. Yeah, look, my best judgment to be consistent.
Sure, yes,
with my
judgment
training is I think the ceasefire will hold. I think tensions will calm down. I think everybody will take a breath. And then I don't know if it's going to happen by Friday, but then you'll start to refocus on Gaza and people will remember that this is still a war going on that seems to not be ending and the same challenges still exist and the hostages are still trapped, or those who are alive and those who have passed. There's still massive food shortages and humanitarian disaster. That's my guess, is that we're going to end up refocusing on that. But I also think, and I don't know what's going to happen Friday, I think everybody needs a couple of days to just catch their breath. But I think you'll also see a little bit of a changed region, not just from the potential that I was talking about. I think that's longer term. I think there's real questions on, now that Iran has been even further diminished, the one country in the region that is in a fairly good position is Turkey, right? And what happens for Turkey going forward, and how do they try to use their influence and their current positioning? They, by the way, like the Iranians, have a rival new defense enterprise, especially drone-filled enterprise, and have become the supplier to a lot of other Middle East countries. I think that there's a real question in terms of Syria and Lebanon and how this is going to happen, and how are they going to develop, and can you get to some place of stability in both of those countries? And look, if you told me a year and a half ago that there was going to be a war with Iran and Hezbollah was going to play literally no part,
oh yeah,
I would have told you were nuts.
Yeah.
And yeah,
here we are.
That's exactly what happened, right? The Middle East, it can change so quickly. So look, Friday, it's a long time away. It's 72 hours.
It's so long away.
But best bet is nothing. My best bet is the ceasefire holds and everything de-escalates a little bit. Longer term, I think there's still a lot of questions left and a lot to play out and a lot of opportunities in the region, significant opportunities for a more peaceful region. The significant impediments to getting there.
Thank you for that judgment. I appreciate that. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, so wild. And I'm glad we have a bunch of stable geniuses at the table to make sure everything is going smoothly for us. Jonathan Panikoff, thank you so much for the Atlantic Council. I really appreciate it. Please come back on. You were so great to talk to. I really appreciate it.
I'd love to. This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
All right, big thanks to Jonathan Panikoff from the Atlantic Council. We'll be right back with our next interview right after this.